Throughout history, there has been a recurring and destructive pattern that has led to the collapse of three of the world's most prominent economies during the past century. Today, as we stand in the year 225, it appears that we are following this very same pattern step by step, with each number aligning meticulously with the previous failures. It's as if we are reading directly from the same blueprint or script that has, time and again, resulted in utter economic catastrophe. Looking back, we see that in the year 1923, Germany was the first to fall into this trap. Their currency's value plummeted so drastically that people resorted to using worthless banknotes as wallpaper, simply desperate to find some use for the paper. On a single day back then, a loaf of bread could cost around 200 billion marks, an astronomical figure by any standard. Workers had to be paid twice daily, because by mid-morning, their wages had already lost half their value, rendering their earnings almost meaningless. Entire life savings evaporated overnight, wiped out by the relentless advance of hyperinflation, and the middle class was decimated in the process. Their wealth wiped away in a matter of hours, leaving a devastated economic landscape. Decades later, in the year 2008, Zimbabwe experienced a similar financial nightmare. The government issued a $100 trillion note, which was worth so little that it could no longer buy a basic bus ticket. Inflation soared to nearly 90% per year, which is to say, 89.76% when expressed in more precise terms. Prices doubled every single day, presenting a nightmare scenario where the currency essentially became useless. The economy was in such disarray that the currency had, quite literally, died. People's savings vanished, businesses closed, and daily life became a struggle for survival amid this chaos. Then, in the year 2018, Venezuela entered the fray with yet another instance of this destructive pattern. The economic crisis was so severe that, on average, citizens lost around 24 pounds of body weight because they could no longer afford enough food to survive. Medical professionals found themselves forced into unthinkable situations, sometimes resorting to prostitution simply to earn enough to survive. Over the span of just 5 years, the Venezuelan currency lost 99.9% of its value, rendering it essentially worthless. This was despite the country possessing the largest oil reserves on the planet, a resource that should have secured its economic stability. Instead, mismanagement and reckless monetary policies plunged the nation into total economic collapse. In all three of these historic cases, Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, the sequence was disturbingly similar. Each experienced a complete currency meltdown following a precise pattern that has repeated itself over and over again. What is truly alarming, however, is that since the year 2020, the United States, along with central banks across the globe, has been indulging in a level of money printing that surpasses the combined sums of all three nations' total prints before their respective collapses. Mark, what makes this even more unsettling is that rather than merely following the progression, we seem to be accelerating it, rushing toward an inevitable breakdown with unprecedented speed and scale. This narrative is not just about what has happened. It's about understanding how nations systematically destroy their currencies, why their governments are often tempted to believe that they can avoid the consequences this time, and, most critically, why the mathematics of inflation suggests that we are now on the brink of our own crisis. Before dissecting this recurring pattern in detail, it's essential to grasp what hyperinflation truly means, not just in academic theory, but in the brutal reality that unfolds on the streets when money ceases to serve as a store of value. Hyperinflation is officially recognized as a situation where the monthly inflation rate exceeds 50%. In layperson's terms, this means that the prices of goods and services are doubling every 30 days. However, when hyperinflation takes hold with full force, this rate of price increase can accelerate far beyond that threshold. In some of the most severe episodes in history, prices have doubled within 24 hours, or even every hour. Imagine starting your Monday morning heading to work, your salary being deposited at midday, and by the time you leave the office at 5 in the evening, the value of that paycheck has already decreased by about a third, meaning it can buy fewer goods than at the start of the day. Meanwhile, grocery stores are continuously raising their prices multiple times a day, and gas stations update their prices hourly to keep pace with the chaos. Driven by panic, people rushed to buy anything tangible, food, supplies, essentials, because they understand that their money's worth can evaporate almost instantly. The shelves in supermarkets quickly become emptied within hours as everyone tries to spend their rapidly depreciating currency. The cash in their wallets feels like burning paper because by tomorrow, it will be worth only half of what it was. All their life savings can vanish in a matter of weeks, even if they have diligently saved for decades. Pensions become worthless, unable to buy a single meal, and insurance policies pay out in money that now holds no purchasing power. Bonds are rendered useless, akin to worthless scraps of paper. Anyone who trusted the system, who diligently saved in the national currency, and who followed the rules of financial prudence, finds themselves losing everything. This is not merely a theoretical scenario or a distant historical event. It is a brutal reality that unfolded in Germany during the Weimar Republic, in Zimbabwe at the height of hyperinflation, and in Venezuela during its ongoing crisis. All of these economic catastrophes occurred precisely because their governments adopted the same flawed approach that many are contemplating today, printing vast amounts of money to address economic problems that, in reality, cannot be solved through mere monetary expansion alone. For as long as they believed it couldn't happen to them, many people cling to the misconception that their specific situation was immune to the chaos of economic collapse. They were convinced their circumstances were unique, that they were somehow protected from the destructive forces that had caused financial devastation elsewhere. However, history has demonstrated, time and again, that such confidence is misplaced. Let us take a close look at how, exactly, a catastrophic hyperinflation unfolded not once, but 3 times, each occurring through a remarkably similar sequence of events. Our examination begins with the first significant modern hyperinflation, Germany, in the year 1923. This particular episode serves as the archetypal model for all subsequent instances of hyperinflation. It is the blueprint against which others can be measured. Following the end of World War I, Germany found itself in a dire predicament. The Treaty of Versailles imposed onerous financial reparations that Germany simply could not meet. An astronomical sum of 132 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to 50,000 tons of gold, or in today's monetary terms, about $1.4 trillion. The German economy, already battered by years of war, had been severely weakened. Industrial output plunged, unemployment skyrocketed, and the government's tax revenues shrank to almost nothing. Faced with this impossible financial scenario, the German authorities faced a stark choice: either default on their reparations payments, risking military occupation and further sanctions, or resort to printing money in large volumes to cover what they owed. They chose the latter. And it is this decision, that of a government unable or unwilling to live within its means, that marks the starting point of every hyperinflation episode. Initially, the situation appeared manageable. Starting in 1919, the Reichsbank began expanding the money supply gradually. Prices crept upward, but the economy still seemed stable enough. The government reassured the public that this inflation was temporary, a necessary step toward rebuilding the shattered nation. Confidence persisted, and for a while, people believed the experiment would be controlled. By the year 1921, the exchange rate had already deteriorated to about 60 marks for every US dollar. That's a troubling but still survivable rate. Yet, things worsened rapidly. In 1922, France occupied the Ruhr region, Germany's vital industrial corridor, demanding reparations that Berlin found impossible to pay. This occupation led to widespread strikes among German workers, halting production entirely. Despite the disruptions, the government continued paying the striking workers with newly printed money, more and more of it. This phase is critical. It marks the point of no return, the point at which inflation accelerates beyond control. By the end of 2022, the exchange rate had soared to approximately 7,400 marks for $1. Inflation was becoming increasingly obvious. Prices were rising noticeably, yet many still believed that the government could regain control. Unfortunately, they were mistaken. The process of printing money had already crossed a vital threshold, shifting from a temporary emergency measure to an act of monetary self-destruction. The year 1923 revealed the true extent of the collapse. Inflation spiraled out of control, with exchange rates skyrocketing from 17,000 marks to the dollar in January to 350,000 in July, and then an astonishing 4.6 million marks in August. By October, it reached 25 billion marks to the dollar, and finally, in November, an unimaginable 4.2 trillion marks. To put this into perspective, in January, a loaf of bread might have cost 250 marks. By November, that same loaf required 200 billion marks. One egg, which previously cost less than $1, now demanded 80 billion marks. A kilogram of butter, if you could find it at all, became a 6 trillion mark item. At the height of this chaos, workers were paid twice daily, rushing to spend their wages before prices skyrocketed further. People hurried to buy essentials during their lunch breaks. Otherwise, their money would be rendered worthless by the time they returned home. Inflation so destroyed the value of currency that many resorted to using wheelbarrows to carry their money, not to buy anything, but simply to transport the vast quantities necessary for daily transactions. Some approximated the level of desperation by burning money in their fireplaces, as it was cheaper than purchasing actual firewood. The middle class, once a pillar of stability, was shattered completely. Those with savings denominated in marks lost everything overnight. Pensioners, employees, bondholders, every fixed income earner saw their savings evaporate in an instant. Society itself fractured under the weight of this economic collapse. Crime rates surged dramatically, and political extremism gained traction among a populace desperate for change. From the resulting chaos, a dangerous faction emerged, the Nazis, who exploited widespread disillusionment and social disintegration to rise to power. Hyperinflation did not merely destroy the currency, it devastated the social fabric of a nation. It eroded trust in the government and financial markets, shattered the collective confidence in the future, and left scars that would influence generations to come. This tragic episode serves as a stark reminder. The destructive pattern of hyperinflation is rooted in the refusal or inability of authorities to maintain fiscal discipline, and its aftermath leaves a trail of social, economic, and political upheaval that can last for decades. Germany had once sworn with unwavering certainty that such a devastating economic collapse would never again be permitted to happen on its watch. The scars of the catastrophic hyperinflation of the early 20th century, which had nearly shattered the fabric of the nation, served as a stark warning etched into collective memory. Yet, nearly 85 years later, another nation found itself unwittingly walking down an eerily familiar path of financial self-destruction, mirroring those historic mistakes with unsettling precision. This was Zimbabwe during the early 2000s, a country renowned for its impressive infrastructure, a well-educated population, and an extensive agricultural export sector that earned it the title of Africa's breadbasket. Once celebrated for its abundant food production and economic vitality, Zimbabwe's fortunes began to unravel rapidly due to a series of political and economic decisions that proved disastrous in the long run. In the year 2000, the government initiated a policy of forcibly seizing farms owned largely by white farmers and redistributing the land among its supporters. This act, seemingly aimed at addressing historical inequalities, instead unleashed a cascade of economic calamities. Agriculture, which had been the backbone of Zimbabwe's economy, plummeted into crisis. Harvests dwindled sharply, food exports ground to a halt, and the country's economy started contracting at a rapid pace. As output declined, so did tax revenue, squeezing the government's ability to fund essential services and debt obligations. Faced with a mounting shortfall, the leadership confronted a dilemma reminiscent of Germany's post-World War I crisis. Should they try to live within their means, or resort to another round of reckless money printing to cover their deficits? Unwilling to tighten the fiscal belt, the government opted for the latter. They began to issue more and more banknotes, flooding the economy with an uncontrollable wave of currency. By 2003, inflation spiraled to an alarming 600%, a figure that, while catastrophic, was still seen as manageable at that time. Authorities brushed off the severity, insisting that this was merely a temporary phenomenon. They pointed fingers outward, blaming international sanctions and external pressures, rather than acknowledging their own reckless monetary policy. Nevertheless, the downward spiral continued unabated. Within 3 years, by 2006, inflation surged to 200%. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe kept printing money at an unprecedented rate, ostensibly to fund government salaries, military expenses, and large-scale projects that the country's economy could no longer support. Then came the point of no return. The inflation rate in the year 2007 reached 100,000%, transforming everyday life into a nightmare of chaos and deprivation. Empty store shelves became commonplace, factories shuttered their doors, and citizens began fleeing the country in droves in search of stability elsewhere. In response, the government doubled down on its desperate measures, printing even more currency and attempting to impose price controls. Such policies, however, inevitably worsened the crisis. Producers found it unprofitable to sell their goods at the artificially low prices mandated by authorities, leading to a drastic reduction in supply. The scarcity of basic goods only intensified, and black markets flourished as prices for everyday items skyrocketed. By the year 2008, Zimbabwe had entered the annals of economic history as a symbol of hyperinflation. In January of that year, inflation soared to a staggering 100,000%. By April, it had increased to 150,000%, and by June, an unimaginable 11 million%. Official statistics from the government ceased altogether by July because they could no longer accurately measure or report the inflation rate, which, according to independent economists, had reached an astonishing 89,760,000% annually. To grasp the enormity of this figure, consider that at such an inflation rate, prices doubled approximately every 247 hours. A simple commodity such as a bottle of soda, which on Monday morning might have cost $1 Zimbabwean dollar, would cost $2 on Tuesday, $4 on Wednesday, and $8 on the following Thursday. By the next Monday, the same bottle of soda would cost a staggering 128 Zimbabwe dollars, more than 100 times the original price in just 1 week. During this period, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe issued a banknote valued at 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars. This was not an exaggeration or a typo. It was a real banknote printed and circulated by the central bank, designed to handle transactions of monumental value. Yet, even $100 trillion proved utterly worthless for everyday needs. People could no longer rely on cash for their basic purchases. Instead, they resorted to bartering, exchanging goods directly, or turned to foreign currencies such as United States dollars and South African rand. Anything except Zimbabwean dollars, which had become a symbol of financial ruin. The economic collapse inflicted devastating damage. The country's gross domestic product shrank by half. Unemployment skyrocketed to 94%, and the average citizen, stripped of their savings, lost an average of 24 pounds due to inability to afford adequate food. Life expectancy, once around 60 years, plummeted to just 34 years within a decade, underscoring the tragic human toll of the crisis. Outbreaks of cholera and other diseases became widespread amid the collapsing infrastructure, and the social fabric of the nation unraveled completely. By 2009, Zimbabwe had officially abandoned its own currency, having driven it into total worthlessness through incessant and reckless monetary expansion. The Zimbabwe dollar, which once had been valued higher than the United States dollar, ceased to exist as a meaningful measure of wealth or exchange. All those who had saved in Zimbabwean dollars, whether containing their life's work or their hard-earned savings, lost everything in an instant. Decades of effort, savings, and stability vanished overnight, replaced by chaos and despair. Once again, the world was quick to dismiss the possibility of such a disaster happening to them, claiming that Zimbabwe was an isolated case, an example of bad governance, corruption, or unique circumstances that could not be repeated elsewhere. But this was a dangerous misconception. The pattern of Zimbabwe's catastrophic downfall was not unique. It was the inevitable outcome of the same fundamental choices, the same economic mistakes, and the same mathematical laws governing inflation and debt that have repeatedly demonstrated their relentless power. A decade later, another nation demonstrated the devastating consequences of the same set of economic missteps. Venezuela, a country endowed with the largest proven reserves of oil in the entire world, containing more recoverable oil than even Saudi Arabia, once stood as a beacon of wealth and promise in South America. In the early 2000s, specifically in the year 2001, Venezuela was considered by many to be the richest country in the continent. Its citizens enjoyed a level of prosperity that saw their gross domestic product per capita surpass that of Brazil, making it one of the most economically advanced nations in the region. The country provided its population with universal health care, free education at all levels, and maintained a functioning democratic system that allowed for political participation and civil liberties. However, everything began to unravel when leaders like Hugo Chavez, followed later by Nicolas Maduro, adopted a series of policies that echoed the typical actions taken by governments suffering from hyperinflation and economic chaos. These leaders embarked on an extensive expansion of social programs that promised free services and support but lacked sustainable sources of revenue to fund them adequately. To finance these ambitious social initiatives, the government resorted to the nationalization of multiple industries, imposing strict price controls on essential goods and restricting private enterprise. When their tax revenues fell short of covering the burgeoning expenses, they chose to print money relentlessly, choosing inflation as their primary tool to bridge the gaps. Between the years 2012 and 2017, Venezuela's money supply skyrocketed by an astonishing 14,000%, meaning that the total amount of money in circulation increased exponentially, not by a modest margin, but by more than 1,000-fold. This relentless printing press was kept in motion by the country's central bank, which generated funds to support government spending, cover mounting budget deficits, and pay for programs that had already become unsustainable. By the year 2016, inflation reached a staggering 800%, causing prices to spiral out of control. Store shelves grew emptier by the day, with basic goods becoming increasingly scarce. The government, in a bid to deflect blame, accused hoarders, speculators, and alleged economic sabotage orchestrated by foreign powers. They enacted price controls, forcing businesses to sell their goods at prices well below their production costs, leading to a predictable demise. As profit margins vanished, many businesses chose to cease operations altogether, causing supply chains to collapse and making essential items vanish from the market entirely. The inflation then soared further, reaching a mind-boggling 2,600% in the year 2017. Life quickly turned into a brutal struggle for survival, with many citizens resorting to eating from trash cans and dumpsters. Reports from zoos indicated that animals were disappearing en masse, only later to be found slaughtered for meat by desperate residents. Hospitals struggled with shortages of basic medicines and supplies, while the electricity grid frequently failed, plunging entire communities into darkness multiple times a week. Despite the painful decline of the Venezuelan bolivar, the government persisted with its reckless printing policies. The year 2018 marked an even more catastrophic collapse. Hyperinflation spiraled out of control, with estimates suggesting that the inflation rate soared to a staggering 1,300,000%. By some measurements, it even approached 2,600,000%. Predictions grew grimmer, with some analysts estimating that by the end of that year, inflation might have reached 10 million%. At such a rate, the cost of everyday items skyrocketed so dramatically that a carton of eggs, which had cost around 200 bolivars in January, would cost 200 million bolivars by December. In a desperate attempt to restore some semblance of stability, the authorities issued a new denomination, introducing a 1 million bolivar note, an administrative effort to keep prices somewhat manageable. Yet, within months, that single note lost much of its value, becoming worthless for even purchasing a simple cup of coffee. They further responded by removing 5 zeros from the currency in 2018, creating what they called the sovereign bolivar, but this measure failed to halt the decline. The same happened in 2021, when they redenominated a second time by removing 6 zeros. Yet, the currency's collapse persisted. By the year 2019, the repercussions were grave. More than 5 million Venezuelans, approximately 7% of the entire population, had fled the country seeking refuge elsewhere. Those who remained endured severe hardship, often losing an average of about 24 pounds due to malnutrition. Skilled workers, doctors, teachers, engineers, began leaving their professions in droves, seeking better opportunities abroad. Some of those who stayed behind resorted to desperate measures, including engaging in prostitution because it offered a more reliable income than their collapsing economy. Others simply fled, abandoning their homes altogether. The Venezuelan economy had shrunk by an incredible 75%, an economic contraction greater than that experienced by Germany following the devastation of the Second World War. The country's vital oil industry, which had long been its backbone, had suffered a 70% decline in production due to the government's inability to maintain and operate infrastructure properly. Today, Venezuela operates in a state of de facto dollarization. Most financial transactions now predominantly occur in US dollars rather than in the worthless local currency. The bolivar, apparently mortally wounded and printed into oblivion, is no longer used or accepted in everyday commerce. Instead, everyone who once trusted the government's promises, who had kept savings in bolivars, and believed in the illusion that the currency would stabilize someday, lost everything. Those savings wiped out, and their financial security shattered. This sequence of events, involving three countries, Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, serves as a stark illustration of how utter currency collapse can unfold. Despite the fact that these nations are on different continents, belong to different political systems, and have varied historical contexts, they share a common pattern rooted in similar poor economic decisions. Each experienced a period of excessive money printing, combined with reckless policies, which ultimately led to hyperinflation and economic ruin. Alarmingly, today, the world's largest economies are beginning to make the same choices, risking a similar fate. The dangerous cyclical nature of these decisions underscores a vital truth. Without discipline, sound policies, and fiscal responsibility, even mighty nations can unravel their currencies and devastate their economies in the blink of an eye. Let's carefully analyze the pattern underlying this ongoing economic phenomenon, because once you truly grasp it, you'll realize why the current situation should evoke a deep sense of concern and even fear. The first critical stage, which we can call the trigger, is always marked by some form of crisis. Historically, every hyperinflationary episode has originated from a major disruptive event. Germany had to settle burdensome war reparations after World War I. Zimbabwe faced severe agricultural failures that devastated its economy, and Venezuela's crisis stemmed from plummeting oil prices combined with the implementation of socialist policies. These crises are the initial shocks that disrupt normal economic functioning, leading to a significant shortfall in the government's budget. As a consequence of these shocks, government revenues, mainly derived from taxes, plummet as economic activity slows abruptly. Meanwhile, the government's commitments to spending on social programs, public services, and debt servicing often stay the same or even increase due to political pressures, creating an unmistakable fiscal imbalance. This combination of declining income and persistent or rising expenditures sets the stage for a financial dilemma. The second stage involves a stark choice faced by authorities. They can either attempt to tighten the fiscal noose by cutting spending and raising taxes, default on their obligations, or resort to the familiar solution, printing money to fill the gap. In practice, cutting spending is politically unviable since it often leads to public outcry and electoral consequences. Increasing taxes, even if implemented, rarely produces enough immediate revenue to cover the shortfall. Defaulting on debts might seem like an option, but typically results in a loss of credibility and power. Therefore, the inevitable and historically recurring response is that they simply choose to print money. It's a choice they make repeatedly because it appears to be the easiest way out, at least temporarily. The third stage involves the government's justification for resorting to money printing. They relentlessly claim that such measures are only temporary, a sort of economic bridge to a brighter future. The concept of modern monetary theory, a belief that governments can sustain high levels of debt indefinitely, becomes the official narrative. Politicians, along with experts and central banks, argue that they possess abundant resources and that economic growth will eventually outpace the rise in the money supply, alleviating inflationary pressures. They promote the idea that inflation is merely transitory and will subside naturally. This rhetoric is often supported by the notion that the current crisis is unique and that the measures they are taking are necessary and prudent. A prime example of this pattern unfolded in March of the year 2020, when the world was faced with an unprecedented crisis, an invisible virus that led to widespread lockdowns and the shutdown of economies around the globe. Governments everywhere were confronted with the same fundamental dilemma: accept the economic pain of contraction and allow markets to adjust naturally, or take drastic action to prevent collapse, which meant flooding the financial system with liquidity. In the face of such a crisis, the response from most central banks and governments was remarkably similar. They chose to print vast sums of money. Throughout that year and the following, the major central banks unleashed unprecedented monetary expansion. The United States Federal Reserve's balance sheet soared from approximately $4 trillion in February of the year 2020 to over $9 trillion by April of 2022. To support the economy and provide relief, the U.S. government allocated around $5 trillion towards COVID-19 relief efforts, injecting this vast amount of freshly created money directly into citizens' bank accounts. Similarly, the European Central Bank expanded its balance sheet by more than 4 trillion euros, while Japan kept up its decades-long policy of relentless money printing. China also injected trillions of yuan into its economy. Everywhere, the response was the same: print money and worry about repercussions later, with the official narrative insisting that these measures were temporary and necessary to safeguard the economy. They promised to unwind these extraordinary measures once the crisis subsided. This approach is often justified using modern monetary theory, which claims that inflation can be controlled and that the temporary increase in the money supply will not cause lasting harm. The public and markets were assured that inflationary effects would be fleeting, thus trusting the experts and policymakers. For a period, this strategy appeared to work. Markets soared, and asset prices, including stocks and real estate, experienced explosive growth. Cryptocurrencies skyrocketed, enriching many investors. This phenomenon is often called the wealth effect, as individuals felt wealthier and more confident with their rising assets. However, by late 2021, cracks in this reassuring narrative began to emerge. Inflationary pressures gradually became more visible, and by the year 2022, they could no longer be denied. In June of that year, the official inflation rate in the United States reached a staggering 9.1%, the highest in decades, surpassing double digits in some parts of Europe and hitting levels not seen since the 1980s in the United Kingdom. Prices for essential goods, food, energy, housing, and everyday necessities began to surge across the board. In response to rising inflation, governments and central banks deployed their usual tactics. They blamed external factors such as geopolitical conflicts, supply chain disruptions, and corporate greed. They deliberately avoided acknowledging the role their own reckless money printing played in fueling inflation. While interest rates were increased to try to curb rising prices, the core problem persisted. Massive amounts of new money continued to be created from nothing. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet still exceeds $7 trillion, which is roughly double the amount it held before the crisis. Meanwhile, government spending has not halted, deficits persist, and the printing presses continue to churn. Now, we arrive at the fourth stage, the phase of acceleration. Over the past 5 years, far more money has been poured into the economy than during the previous decade combined. This relentless expansion and the continual increase in the money supply are fundamentally altering the economic landscape. If history is any guide, this pattern inevitably leads to a climactic and potentially catastrophic episode of hyperinflation, where the value of money collapses and the traditional monetary system unravels under the weight of excessive issuance. In essence, the pattern is clear and alarmingly familiar. From crises, governments resort to printing money, invoke temporary rationales, and claim that inflation will be under control. Yet, each cycle ends with inflation spiraling beyond control, economic instability, and the loss of confidence in the monetary system. This ongoing trajectory now stands at a critical juncture, one that could define the economic stability for years or even decades to come. The reasons provided for the current situation remain fundamentally the same as before. The excuses offered, the justifications given, and the patterns observed all follow a familiar and recurring script. The key question that looms large is how far we can push these mechanisms before the inevitable consequences of economic mathematics, which cannot be ignored or outrun, finally catch up with us. It's essential that we recognize the early warning signs, the unmistakable indicators that have historically appeared just prior to every major hyperinflationary collapse, signaling an approaching crisis. One of the clearest and most consistent warning signals is the relentless expansion of the money supply. To illustrate, in the United States, the M2 money supply, the broadest measure of money circulating in the economy, escalated by approximately 40% during the span from the year 2020 to 2022. This represented an unprecedented level of increase during peacetime conditions, breaking all previous records for monetary expansion. Concurrently, government deficits have spiraled out of control. For instance, in the year 2024, the United States registered a deficit surpassing $1,800 billion, which equated to more than 6% of the nation's gross domestic product. Compared to a healthy and growing economy, such figures are already alarming. But when considering sovereign debt levels globally, the situation grows even more dire. Japan, during its period of economic recovery, had debt that soared to 264% of its GDP, clearly unsustainable within any stable financial system. These extraordinary debt levels are incompatible with what we consider a stable, healthy system. Yet, the narrative of inflation persists despite the apparent contradictions. Official statistics, such as the Consumer Price Index, claim that inflation remains relatively modest, around 3 to 4%. However, the reality for everyday consumers paints a much different picture. The costs of essential goods and services, food, housing, insurance, far exceed those official figures. Techniques like shrinkflation, substitution, hedonic adjustments, and other statistical manipulations serve to distort the true picture, concealing the mounting inflation that impacts ordinary people's lives on a daily basis. Simultaneously, asset prices, stocks, real estate, and other investments are reaching levels that seem increasingly disconnected from their underlying economic fundamentals. Stock markets are flirting with record highs, even as real wages, what people actually take home, are declining or stagnating. Entire generations find themselves unable to afford homes, with housing prices soaring far beyond their means. Wealth inequality has widened to levels reminiscent of the early 20th century, creating a social and economic rift that threatens long-term stability. As trust in fiat currency begins to erode, alternative forms of value storage have gained popularity. Bitcoin, for instance, has surged in value because many individuals no longer trust the central banks and governments to maintain the stability of their currencies. Likewise, gold prices are reaching historic peaks, reflecting a growing belief that traditional currencies are losing their reliability. Furthermore, emerging economic powers like the BRICS nations are actively developing alternative payment systems, seeking to reduce dependence on the US dollar. Foreign central banks are gradually decreasing their holdings of dollar assets, and signs of systemic stress are becoming increasingly visible. All these developments point toward the cracks in the global financial facade widening. Governments continue to justify ongoing fiscally irresponsible policies by citing various crises. Each financial or geopolitical upheaval is exploited as a pretext to implement even more spending, more money printing, and expanded government interventions, covering the areas of climate change initiatives, infrastructure projects, defense spending, and social programs. There is always a reason for more expenditure. The patterns are predictable. What's crucial is that there is rarely a well-defined plan to curb or reverse these trends. Historically, nations have believed they could halt their spirals at some point. Germany after paying reparations, Zimbabwe after land reforms, Venezuela once oil prices recovered. However, none of these countries actually managed to stop their descent, because once you begin this cycle of unchecked spending and borrowing, stopping usually means accepting the harsh realities of the consequences: economic collapse, social chaos, or systemic failure. Governments, by their very nature, are reluctant to willingly accept collapse, which only prolongs the inevitable and deepens the crisis. This pattern is evident and unmistakable. We are currently following the same trajectory. The pressing questions are how quickly the acceleration will happen and how severe the ultimate outcome will be. Historically, in the last century alone, three major economies, Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, embarked on exactly this same destructive path. On each occasion, entities believed they were somehow immune or different, convinced that they could defy the laws of economic physics just one more time. But history's verdict is clear. The mathematics of printing and debt accumulation always outpaces the ability to sustain or hide the truth. Prosperity, after all, cannot simply be printed out of thin air. Wealth cannot be created ex nihilo, out of nothing. And the consequences of endless monetary expansion are inescapable, with the bill always coming due in the end. Since the year 2020, the world's leading economies have expanded their money supplies to levels exceeding the combined total of all three prior hyperinflation examples. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China have all pursued aggressive monetary easing policies, following the same detrimental playbook that led to catastrophic failures in the past. Despite knowing these historical lessons, many continue to insist that this time it's different. They argue that advances in policy tools, better economic understanding, and improved knowledge give them the confidence to manage the fallout. That was the mantra in Myanmar, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, spoken until the inevitable collapse shattered any illusions of control. History may not repeat itself in an exact replica, but its echoes are unmistakable. And right now, the echoes are deafening, warning of the storm that is approaching and that cannot be indefinitely delayed. The signs are unmistakable. The massive increase in money supply, mounting debt levels, rising wealth inequality, erosion of trust in fiat currency, and geopolitical shifts all combine into a chorus of warning signals that cannot be ignored. The question remains, how soon will the reckoning arrive, and just how severe will the aftermath be? We are currently navigating through the fourth stage of this recurring cycle, often referred to as the acceleration phase, which marks a critical juncture in the pattern's progression. At this point, previous instances of this phenomenon have consistently spiraled out of control, and what began as a gradual increase has now become an uncontrollable surge. In this stage, the process of printing money fuels more printing, creating a vicious cycle that accelerates exponentially. This relentless expansion leads to inflation that grows at an unprecedented rate, pushing the value of the currency into a downward spiral that feels increasingly unstoppable. Historically, this pattern has signaled the onset of a currency's death spiral, an unstoppable slide toward instability. Despite the grim pattern, there remains a faint hope that humanity might break free from this cycle. There is a possibility that modern central banks, perhaps with innovative strategies and unprecedented precision, could find a way to carefully navigate through this turmoil. Perhaps they could delicately unwind the staggering amount of money, around $20 trillion, that has been printed over the years, doing so without triggering catastrophic consequences. Perhaps this time truly could be different. Perhaps the typical rules do not apply this time around, and new solutions have been devised. However, the established pattern and the fundamental mathematics behind it strongly suggest otherwise. The numbers, immutable and unforgiving, point to the same conclusions that history has repeatedly demonstrated. Such attempts to control or halt the process often fail or lead to even greater instability. As we look back at the recorded instances of this phenomenon, 3 times before, the lessons learned from those episodes serve as a stark warning. History's verdict, reinforced by the math, indicates that we are approaching yet another moment to learn this same lesson, and likely through experience that will be as harsh and instructive as the past ones. If contemplating these insights has provided you with a fresh perspective on what might lie ahead, then perhaps you will want to pay close attention to this unfolding pattern. When this cycle reaches its ultimate phase, understanding the dynamics behind it will become crucial. Recognizing the causes and consequences will help you grasp what exactly happened and why. As history continues to serve as the most reliable source of answers, I will guide you toward where to look and what signals to watch for, so that you can better understand the forces shaping our economic landscape.